Hello, and a very warm welcome from Sarah and myself to the 2022 Oxford Farming Conference. Of course, until a few weeks ago, we were very much hoping to meet face to face in Oxford. However, given the increasing concern and uncertainty around the Omicron variant, the OFC Council made the very difficult decision just before Christmas to take the conference online.
Yes, thank you, Barbara. We did this with a very heavy heart. One of the delights of Oxford has always been the ability to meet old friends and to make new ones face to face at a point in the calendar where there is some time and space to look forward to the year ahead. The backdrop of Oxford, with its unparalleled academic history and beautiful meeting areas, added immeasurably, I'm sure we all feel, to that experience.
However, last year's online conference showed that it was possible to inspire, educate and inform a wider audience and those who may traditionally come to Oxford regularly. Our intention always had been to ensure that there was a digital offer that would run alongside the face-to-face conference to ensure that the Oxford experience would be extended to the widest audience possible.
We have been immensely encouraged by the hundreds of people who've joined the fringes today and the passion and enthusiasm they've brought to sessions. And we're incredibly excited to present the rest of the programme to you this year, which we think reflects the wide experience of our council directors and will provide many of those wonderful Oxford moments where you come across thoughts and ideas in presentations that will inform your thinking for many months or indeed many years to come.
We are sure that you will find that one of those light bulb moments will come during the Oxford Report, which the Council has brought back to provide thought leadership in an area of significant topical interest. We're delighted that the first part of this work is being presented now as our fringe meeting in collaboration with WWF and Green Alliance, which considers how far farming can go to reach net zero. We will now hand over to Callum Weir from WWF, who'll be chairing this session. Callum, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you, Sarah, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to this session at the brilliant virtual Oxford Farming Conference 2022, funded by the WWF and Tesco Partnership. My name is Callum Weir, and I work for WWF as a Sustainable Agriculture Specialist. Today, I'm joined on a panel with Alice Ritchie, Sustainable Agricultural Manager at Tesco, Rebecca Mason, Consultant at Eunomia Research and Consulting, and Jim Elliott, Senior Policy Advisor at Green Alliance. Today, the WWF and Tesco Partnership have launched 2 reports to help farmers and our food system navigate and contribute to our collective journey to net zero. The Sustainable Agriculture Workstream of our partnership commissioned and funded these reports because agriculture is a unique sector. It produces emissions, currently around 10% of the UK greenhouse gas emissions, according to the CCC, but land also has the capacity to sequester carbon. Through these reports, we want to understand about the capacity agriculture has to both reduce emissions and sequester carbon, and provide new valuable information to farmers, land managers, and the whole food supply chain on the opportunities and risks for the sector. During this session, we will introduce the WWF and Tesco Partnership and explain our interest in agriculture and why we commissioned these reports. We will then learn more about the findings of these reports from the authors themselves and provide you with the opportunity to ask them any questions you may have. After both authors have presented, our panel will then discuss some of the broader topics that surround the pursuit of a net zero food and land use system. So despite being very different organisations, Tesco and WWF have a shared common ambition to make affordable, healthy, sustainable food available to everyone. WWF's Living Planet report in 2018 showed that wildlife populations have fallen by 60% in the last 50 years. The single biggest reason for this decline is the global food system, what we eat, how we produce it, and how it reaches our plates. But many here will recognise that the issues we face go beyond wildlife decline. The world faces a triple challenge of avoiding irreversible damage from climate change, feeding a growing population, and restoring nature. We cannot rise to these challenges without fixing the food system, and we cannot fix the food system without farmers. With these challenges in mind, 3 years ago, the WWF and Tesco Partnership came together with the aim of halving the environmental impact of the average UK shopping basket. That's not just the Tesco shopping basket, that's the UK shopping basket. And in order to deliver this ambitious goal, we are focusing on 3 key areas: helping customers eat more sustainably, restoring nature in food production, and eliminating waste. To reach our partnership goal of halving the environmental impact of the average UK shopping basket by 2030, we need to better understand and track the impact of the entire food value chain, from production to consumption. Our WWF basket covers 7 key areas, and we launched this pioneering industry measure at COP26. Initially developed with our partner Tesco, WWF is now working with UK retailers who share our vision. And importantly, whilst it is designed to help companies who have a responsibility to help fix the food system, it is also used to hold them to account. The sustainable agriculture workstream of our basket is the largest and arguably the most important workstream of our partnership with Tesco. And my Tesco counterpart, Alice Ritchie, will now explain more about the work we do on agriculture.
Thanks, Callum. So to deliver our sustainable agriculture goals across the sector, we've got a number of different tactics. These include political advocacy, sectoral advocacy, working with farmers, taking landscape scale action, and then also working across different industry initiatives. There are 4 key themes for this work: climate change, water, biodiversity, and soil. Although obviously I imagine everyone on this call will know that these themes are incredibly interlinked, and there's plenty of wider implications around food security, food production, supply chains, things like that. We've had lots and lots of highlights over the past few years of the partnership. We've had some really amazing groundbreaking reports, including the 2 that we're going to hear about today. We've had others on soil health and the supply chain, some really amazing landscape scale work looking to reduce water pollution in key catchments like the Wye and Usk. We've funded different on-farm interventions like herbal lays and methane inhibitors. And I'm really excited to be talking more about the 2 reports on on-farm emissions and carbon sequestration today. We've got some really exciting stuff in the pipeline too for 2022, looking to understand a bit more about lowland peat, on-farm biodiversity metrics, and hopefully also regenerative agriculture. Tesco has committed in October to some new climate change targets for our supply chain, aiming to be net zero by 2050, across the supply chain or our scope 3 emissions. This is on top of our commitment to achieve net zero across Tesco Group operations by 2035. We know that a lot of these emissions across our supply chain come from our agriculture base, so we've got a big job ahead of us to work with the sector to make sure we're reducing these emissions and increasing sequestration. Emissions reductions are very much the focus and priority right now as we work towards our targets, both within the business but also across our supply chain. So thinking about what that looks like on farm is an incredibly important part of our strategy. So I'm really excited to hear this evening from Rebecca Mason, who is a consultant at Eunomia Research and Consulting, about the report that's been written by Eunomia and Innovation for Agriculture on farm level interventions to reduce agricultural greenhouse gas emissions in the UK. So over to you, Becca.
Thanks, Alice. So to really sort of outline the key aims of our project and how we went about it, we were aiming to provide advice to farmers for what they can do on their farm to reduce their emissions, as well as providing advice to policymakers and key stakeholders for what they can do to support farmers and increase uptake of those emissions interventions. So we started the project with a literature review to identify what the key interventions for reducing emissions are and assess their reduction potential. We then took those to a farmer workshop to hear from farmers their thoughts on what interventions they consider to be feasible on farms at the moment and what the key barriers to implementation are. And these outputs were then channeled into 2 key aspects. We had a farmer-facing how-to guide providing advice to farmers, and a policy-facing report providing advice to policymakers on what they can do to support them. So we started off by collating a long list of interventions assessed in the literature and streamlining those to the 20 highest impact interventions. Each of these was then scored according to 4 key variables. The first 2 came from the literature and were national greenhouse gas abatement potential and the cost of abatement. And the second 2 came from the farmer workshop, farmer views on likelihood of implementation and farmer views on cost benefit. But before we look at the results of our analysis, I really want to pause for a second to consider what the key sources of agricultural emissions are. This is really important because the key sources of emissions provide the greatest potential for reduction and really should be the focus of our work. We only have so much money and so much time, so we need to really understand what our priorities are. This pie chart presents the key sources of emissions according to the CCC's 6th carbon budget. And these are the emissions that current emission reduction targets are aiming to address. If you look at this pie chart, clearly methane from enteric fermentation is the dominant source. But I really want to ask the question of, is there anything missing from this pie chart? Are there any relevant emissions that could be reduced on farm that we haven't considered? Because if there are, and they haven't been included, then any interventions that reduce these emissions will not be considered impactful. So a key factor that I think is missing from that pie chart is recognizing the climate impact of occupying land for agriculture. Reducing agricultural land use is going to be key to reducing the climate impact of agriculture. So we need to think about how we're going to incentivize that. If we only consider the emissions from the previous pie chart, then the climate benefit of interventions that increase land use efficiency is not recognised and is not prioritised. The challenge really comes in that this report is focusing on greenhouse gas emissions reductions. The following presentation is focusing on sequestration, and land use efficiency sits in between the 2 of those. Preventing agricultural expansion reduces emissions by avoiding deforestation, and releasing land from agriculture helps sequester carbon by facilitating natural regeneration. But although these are slightly different outcomes, both are driven by the efficiency of agricultural land use. So they are operating on different timescales, but opposite sides of the same coin. And when considering land use, we really need to take a global perspective because our food systems are globalized. So any change in land use or land use efficiency in one place will have impacts elsewhere. You know, a classic example of this is shifting soy production from the Amazon to avoid deforestation to the UK without an increase in land use efficiency will simply displace the production of other products overseas, which may in turn lead to deforestation, perhaps in the Amazon, which hasn't really solved the problem. So to try and illustrate this, you know, provide a sense of scale to this whole land use debate, I've included this pie chart on the right, which uses data from a paper in Nature by Searching et al., which was looking at the carbon opportunity cost of agricultural land use. And according to his analysis, if we look at soybean production as just an example, the vast majority of soy's climate impact relates to agricultural land use rather than direct production emissions. So if we don't recognise that, interventions that displace soy for alternatives with a lower land requirement aren't considered impactful. So in our report and our analysis, we've primarily focused on the emissions that I showed you in that previous pie chart from the CCC 6 carbon budget, because that's how interventions have been analysed in the previous literature. But we did include one intervention as a sort of illustrative example, which looks at replacing soy and animal feed with alternatives with a lower land requirement, such as insects fed on food waste or microbial protein. So with that in mind, I want to move on to the results of our analysis. So this graph displays all 20 of the interventions we assessed according to the 4 variables that I previously outlined. So it does look a bit complicated, but I will talk you through it. So each bubble is an intervention. The size of the bubble relates to the national greenhouse gas abatement potential of that intervention. So a big bubble is high impact. The colour relates to farmer views on likelihood of implementation. So a green bubble is likely to implement, red is not. The x-axis refers to farmer views on profitability. So an intervention that's further to the right is considered more profitable on farm than those further to the left. And the y-axis relates to cost of abatement in pounds per tonne of CO2. So interventions that are located higher up on this graph are more cost effective to society. So when we presented the interventions like this, they fell neatly into three sort of main clusters. We've got an easy wins cluster, which is up in the top right corner, which farmers consider likely to implement and profitable. We've got a more challenging cluster, which are interventions that farmers consider they're less likely to implement and are less profitable. And then we've got this further research needed cluster down at the bottom, which is clustered there because there wasn't information available in the literature on cost of abatement. So this bubble is in effect floating on the y-axis, and there wasn't a lot of information in the literature on these interventions in general. So the easy wins cluster seems really promising. And although none of the highest impact interventions fall into that cluster, none of them are insignificant. There are some moderately sized bubbles there. But nevertheless, there are still some really key barriers that we need to think about. Whilst farmers, for example, recognise that precision fertiliser applications might be profitable in the long term, there's an initial investment cost that is an issue. You also have to ask yourself that this M5, which is improving livestock health, why is that not already being maximised? Perhaps farmers don't know how to maximise their livestock health, but the ones that we spoke to thought they were already doing that. So perhaps that the potential is overestimated. Perhaps we need further data granularity. The next cluster is the more challenging cluster. Most interventions in this cluster are relatively low impact, with the clear exception of M1, which relates to feed additives to reduce methane from ruminants. This is clearly an intervention that we need to focus policy on because farmers don't want to do it, but the climate impact is large. You could argue that this intervention should go into the further research needed cluster, because one of the key barriers that farmers identified was that there isn't enough information and evidence and long-term trials to understand what the impact of these feed additives really are. What are their side effects? What effects will they have on their farm? And there's emerging evidence that there are new feed additives that we don't know much about yet that might be even more impactful than the ones that we've assessed here. And then finally, moving on to this further research needed cluster. In this cluster, there are two standout interventions that look really high impact. We've got M3, which relates to animal feed alternatives to soy with a lower land requirement. So that's sort of insects and microbial protein. Farmers were really keen to do this, even though they don't think it will be that profitable for their farm. They were keen to move away from soy. But the barrier here really is R&D. These things aren't available readily on the market yet. So we need to think about how we can focus R&D on that as an area. And then M20 is another big high impact one over here, which looks like a win-win-win. Farmers want to do it, it's profitable, and it's got a high climate impact. And the main barrier there is tight product specification requirements from supermarkets that don't enable farmers to reduce on-farm food waste. So having looked at our results, I just wanted to take a moment to discuss, to go back to our emissions accounting and discuss whether we're placing enough emphasis on reducing methane. The timescales over which we assess the impact of greenhouse gases determines their relative importance. And methane is an extremely potent but short-lived greenhouse gas. So if its impacts are assessed over a shorter timescale, it becomes much more important. And interventions that reduce methane become much more impactful. So for example, the bubble on that graph that relates to feed additives will get much bigger. Conventionally, we assess greenhouse gases over 100 years, which is referred to as GWP 100. But if we use a 20-year timescale, then methane, it becomes a methane story, really. That is the key source that we need to focus on. And these pie charts are just trying to illustrate what that might look like if we adjusted for GWP 20. So this has taken the emission sources from the CCC's sixth carbon budget and adjusted the methane aspect of those to GWP 20. It hasn't adjusted the other gases to GWP 20. And if that was done, then the relative impact of methane would be even higher. And the size of the pie charts has just been adjusted to reflect the fact that absolute emissions will increase if you shorten the timescales. So to sum up, really, there were 4 key standout messages that came out of our report. The first is that we need to support farmers. There's a whole range of fragmentary, confusing advice that's being bombarded at farmers about how to reduce emissions on their farm. And we actually need to think about how we can really bring that together to provide a consistent evidence base. It needs to be consistent, it needs to be robust and backed up by evidence, and it needs to be impartial and not delivered through agribusiness that have a vested interest in selling you a product. We need to consider financial incentives for supporting interventions that have potentially no clear farm benefit, but a huge climate benefit, such as feed additives would be the classic one there, and also to support some of the easy wins that have a high investment cost. The second key recommendation is that we need to develop more holistic greenhouse gas emissions accounting to understand our priorities. As I mentioned before, we've only got so much time, social capital and money to throw at these problems, and we really need to understand where are we going to have the highest impact. And so something that this report was trying to raise as an issue for discussion, we weren't trying to solve the problem, but is how we account for land use when we're considering emissions and how we prioritize interventions that really increase land use efficiency. And the second thing there is shorter timescales and whether we should be placing more emphasis on short-lived greenhouse gases such as methane, given we need to really be doing things in the next 20 years. The third recommendation is around R&D, and that we need some targeted R&D to deliver change where the potential impact is greatest. So as we've seen through that presentation, methane is a huge issue. And there are some still relatively innovative interventions like feed additives that need further R&D and more evidence behind them. And similarly, if we're considering reducing the land use requirement associated with animal feed, then animal feed alternatives such as insects and microbial protein could be huge. Their impact could be incredible, but we just don't know enough about them yet, and they're not market ready. And then the final one is around system change. We need system change to deliver on-farm food waste reductions by changing product specification requirements. And we also need it to deliver 2 factors that are out of scope of this report, but we're still considering as important aspects in reducing emissions from agriculture. And those are off-farm food waste and dietary shifts. So that really brings me to the end of my presentation, but I'm hoping that was interesting. Thank you for listening. And I'm not sure if there are time for questions, but I'll hand back over to Callum.
Thanks, Becca. That was great. And what I'll do is I've made a note of some great questions, particularly from Craig and from Sue. And what we'll do is we'll see if we'll, to keep some time, we'll have a look at and go over those at the end, perhaps. But I'll hand straight over to Jim from Green Alliance to talk about our other report. Becca really explained well the role of emissions reductions, and now Jim can talk about sequestration.
Brilliant. Thanks, Callum, and hello, everyone. I hope you're enjoying this excellent conference so far. Thanks as well to Oxford Carbon Conference and the WWF Tesco Partnership for arranging this event and enabling the work. My name's Jim Elliott. I'm a Senior Policy Advisor at Green Alliance, which is an environmental charity and think tank, and we focus on ambitious leadership to improve the environment. And our kind of half of this project was looking into what the kind of farm level sequestration, carbon sequestration opportunities are for agriculture within the UK. and how carbon markets might apply to agri-carbon and how they might be made robust and fair. And we carried out this work alongside researchers from the University of Manchester and Scotland's Royal College. I'm very grateful to my fellow authors, Dr. Johnny Ritson, Professor Mark Reed, and Dr. Oscar Kennedy Blundell. So to reach net zero, it's pretty clear that we are going to have to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere and store it. That's fairly well accepted. And the great thing is that land can store carbon in two ways. It stores carbon underground in soils, and above ground in trees and other plants. And with 70% of our land in the UK being farmed, there's clear opportunities to increase both soil carbon through various regenerative farming practices and above ground carbon with kind of more and bigger hedges and agroforestry in a farming setting. In this research, we didn't include land use change options like afforestation as agri-carbon. We focused just on interventions that can sequester carbon in a kind of working agricultural setting. So the team at Manchester University started out by looking at the kind of scientific evidence on the range of different interventions for removing and storing carbon. And the headline here is that particularly when it comes to soil carbon, there's still quite a lot of uncertainty in the science around how much carbon will actually be stored in soils through different regenerative practices. The best evidence that we have is on incorporating residues, crop residues into soils, but the other interventions are kind of that get quite a lot of attention, sort of no and low till agriculture, cover crops in rotations. The evidence on the climate benefits of those is a bit less certain. They do all have quite significant co-benefits for other environmental issues and for agriculture, so around biodiversity, water quality, soil health. So they're really good things to do, and we need to keep working on the policy instruments and market instruments to get those kind of regenerative practices more widely used. But the climate benefit specifically is a bit less clear. Not to say that there isn't one, just that we don't know exactly how big it will be. Quickly as well, the team looked, as well as looking at kind of regenerative agriculture practices, they also looked at some engineered carbon removal options that might also have impacts for farming. So these were enhanced rock weathering, where you put kind of powdered rock onto the fields and it reacts with CO2 in the air. There's biochar, where you basically just plow charcoal into the soil. And then bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, where you're burning plant matter and for energy, and then capturing the CO2 and storing it underground. Those are a bit further down the line in terms of their development. A bit less far down the line in terms of their development, a bit further down the line in terms of when they might be making a kind of useful contribution. And there's a lot of work to be done on working out ways to do them sustainably and safely. So they're kind of a bit in development. I'll just skip back one. So one thing with all this uncertainty is that we need to have really strong standards when it comes to agri-carbon, particularly with those kind of soil carbon interventions. They work differently in different contexts, and that you may see different results even within a field for the same intervention, let alone between fields, between farms, and between different areas of the country. So it's really important to have really strong standards around measuring the actual carbon that's been stored. It's very difficult to predict how much carbon there's going to be in a particular place, we need to have good measurement and verification of it, and that presents some challenges from a market perspective because it can introduce costs. It's also very easy for carbon to be re-released into the atmosphere in the future after it's been sequestered, and that's obviously not going to be a good thing from a climate perspective. You only have to kind of look at what's happening with ash dieback to see how that might work. You know, we've got all this carbon that's been stored in ash trees for decades and centuries that will now be effectively be released because of ash dieback disease. So there's no guarantee in natural carbon storage, and there are ways to reduce those risks, making sure you pay for ongoing management on long periods and having kind of buffer pools of credits that can be held and used in future if there is a release of carbon. But those all need to be included in kind of really strong standards. So overall, the total amount of carbon that can be sequestered in an agricultural setting is relatively small compared to predictions of what engineered solutions might be able to sequester. So the blue and orange lines on here show yearly sequestration for agroforestry and hedges, that's the blue one, and farmed soils, that's the orange one, up to 2050. And you can see these are quite a lot lower than the fainted grey lines, which are the kind of engineered solutions. But as I've said, we don't know exactly how those engineered solutions are going to work, even for some of them, if they will work. And certainly there are lots of questions to answer around the sustainability of them. And that work is going to be ongoing over the next kind of decade or so. So there's a really important role for agri-carbon, particularly over the next 10 to 15 years, to start to sequester carbon, start to draw down carbon from the atmosphere while we work all that out, while we reduce emissions in the wider economy, and while we develop other carbon removal alternatives. You'll also notice that the orange line dips and ends at the end of the period. That's basically because soil carbon soil can only sequester carbon for a certain period of time before it's saturated and reaches a kind of equilibrium. The same, of course, is also true of woodlands, but over a much longer time period. So with soils, it varies a lot, but the time period that's normally used is around 20 years that sequestration can happen, and then it reaches equilibrium. So that's why that sequestration tails off over time. There's also quite a lot of uncertainty in the total amount that soil carbon sequestration will be. So what we've included here is from our evidence review, and it looks just at crop residue incorporation and no and low till as the two interventions. It might be that more carbon can be sequestered in soils with other combinations of interventions, and some estimates are much bigger. So the Royal Society wrote a report a few years ago into greenhouse gas removals, and they estimated that 10 megatons of CO2 per year could be sequestered in soils. So that's about kind of 3 times bigger than what we've included here, but still noticeably lower than those engineered solutions. So in terms of the size of the opportunity overall for farming in the UK, this depends a bit on, well, in fact, a lot on how much you can sell your carbon for and how much demand there is for it. So this chart is showing all of the potential for carbon sequestration in the landscape. So it's got the kind of on-farm options, the agroforestry and hedges and soil carbon, and then the more kind of land use change options, afforestation and peatland restoration. And it basically says if you could sell all of that carbon sequestration for a certain amount, say the £25 or £50 per tonne, then what does that look like overall across the country? And if you could do that, and if you could sell it for £50 a tonne, that's quite significant. So this is comparing to current cap funding. Please ignore the y-axis numbers. They're completely wrong. That should be in billions, and there should be decimal points in there so that you can actually read the numbers. But broadly, what we're talking about is kind of £3.5 billion of cap funding per year, and then the sequestration potentially up to the range of kind of 1.7 to £2 billion a year but that relies on being able to achieve that carbon price of £50 a tonne, which is quite a lot higher than the current voluntary market price. It also relies on there being demand for those kind of carbon credits, and there are other ways that companies can do carbon offsetting. So agricarbon needs to be able to prove that it's good and that people should invest in it. And then finally, worth noting that over half of this potential is in land use change options rather than on-farm options. And those on-farm options, as I've said, some of them, especially around soil carbon sequestration, can be quite difficult, quite an involved process. So there are challenges. So just quickly, in terms of how this might look in practice, in terms of the kind of voluntary carbon market in the UK, we have a couple of schemes already up and running, the Woodland Carbon Code and Peatland Code, which shall enable landowners to create credits from woodland planting and peatland restoration. First thing to say about these is, and I should say there are also new codes being developed at the moment that apply more to the agri-carbon context. So a farm soil carbon code is under development, as is a hedgerow carbon code, and hopefully those will kind of come online in the next few years. So firstly, these are domestic only, so you can only sell those credits, and they can only be used to offset emissions in the UK. You can't sell them internationally, and that's basically because if you sell them internationally, they can't be counted against the UK's net zero target, so it makes it more difficult to achieve net zero. Second thing to note is, and it's probably quite an obvious one, but I think it's worth reiterating, is that credits can only be used once. So if you sell a carbon credit as an offset as a farmer, you cannot use that to count against your own farm's emissions and make claims about the net emissions of your farm. Now that may not seem very significant at the moment, but in future, if consumers or the farmers' customers, or even potentially the government, introduce requirements around low carbon or net zero produce, then it could become a problem, particularly if carbon has been sold up front. So one thing that you can do in the Woodland Carbon Code and Peatland Code, which a lot of people do, is to sell all of the carbon that they expect to sequester up front. And if you do that in a farming setting, then you may run into problems in the future in terms of meeting your own decarbonisation obligations. Good news is, on the next box, that carbon credits don't have to be sold as offsets. There are companies that are financing kind of verified emissions reductions and carbon removals without making a claim of offsetting against their own emissions. They simply say, we've contributed towards, the decarbonisation of agriculture, and use that as a kind of corporate social responsibility claim. And in that case, there's a lot more flexibility around the claims that the farmer can make over that carbon. So that hopefully makes it quite clear that the way that carbon is bought and sold matters quite a lot. And that's just laid out in a little bit more detail here with a few different scenarios for how farmers might buy and sell carbon credits, create and sell carbon credits. So the kind of top scenario there, it basically involves the farmer creating a verified carbon credit by sequestering some carbon, having it verified so everyone's happy, they know it's there. That in this scenario is financed by a supply chain company, but they don't make an offset claim for it. But the end result is that the farmer can make a claim about having a low carbon or net zero farm or product. The supply chain business that paid for it benefits because the product that they're buying off the farmer is lower carbon, so they can then say the product that they're selling on is lower carbon. In the kind of bottom scenario, if a farmer were to sell an offset credit outside of the supply chain, In that case, the farmer gets the benefit of having that credit paid for. They get the money, so that's great. But they do not have any kind of claim over the carbon. That can't be used for their farm emissions at all. And of course, that rolls on to the supply chain businesses that they're selling their produce to. The produce is effectively higher carbon for that reason, and it goes down the chain. So there's clearly quite a unique role for the food supply chain here. That's not to say, you know, don't sell a carbon offset credit to a company outside the supply chain. It's just to say that there are different benefits and risks depending on who you're selling to and what claims are being made. And we've talked about standards. So just to sum up, I have three kind of takeaways, which hopefully provide a bit of a starting point for creating a fair and environmentally robust agri-carbon market. The first is, as I've just been talking about on the previous slide, the food sector has quite a unique role to play. And for farmers, a clear kind of message of the research is, yes, there's an opportunity for you here, but be aware of the different ways that carbon is being bought and sold, and make sure that any agreements that you enter into work for you now and also work for your farm business in the future. Secondly, particularly with agri-carbon sequestration, it's very complex in terms of the interventions that need to be implemented, and there's lots of uncertainty in terms of the results that they will produce in different contexts. So there's a really strong need for good standards, and they need to be properly applied to ensure there's actually a real environmental benefit. And as I say, that work is underway, so watch that space, not by Green Alliance, I should say. And finally, offsetting in general can do more harm than good if companies do it instead of reducing their own emissions. So we need to look kind of a lot more carefully at ways to ensure that companies are reducing their own emissions first and only using offsets for emissions that they genuinely can't reduce. Otherwise, we make it much more difficult to reach net zero and stop the climate crisis. Thanks.
Thank you, Jim. That was really great. And what I'll do, Jim, is if you stay around, and then Becca and Alice bring you into the fold again, and I'll get straight into questions actually. And this is a question sort of surmised from what a few people have said, and particularly Colin. And we focus a lot on carbon. You know, is such a focus on carbon within the food and land use system, does it help us, or is it more of a hindrance to focus so much on carbon? Maybe Jim, do you want to kick off on that?
Yeah, so in a way, it's not surprising that we focus a lot on carbon, because there's been so much focus on the climate crisis, and it is a genuine crisis and needs a strong response. I think there has been a lot more awareness recently, in recent years, that there are other sustainability issues, and they need to be dealt with hand in hand. I think a singular focus on carbon is risky, and that shows quite particularly with kind of land use and agriculture. And some other analysis that we did kind of as part of this project, but in a different report, showed that at relatively believable carbon prices, 30 to 40 pounds a tonne of CO2, it would become economically rational to basically stop farming in the fens. Now, from an environmental perspective, that's probably a really good thing to do. From a food production perspective, in the UK, not so much, because we produce about a third of our food there. Obviously, and that's because there are so much emissions from lowland peat that's used for agriculture. So clearly that kind of agriculture needs to change to reduce emissions, but simply stopping farming, producing food there entirely, which is kind of the result of a singular focus on carbon, not necessarily a good thing to do.
A very, very good point. We've got to look at the triple challenge of food production and not offshoring our environmental impact. That's crucial. Becca or Alice, do you have anything to add on that point around a focus on carbon being maybe a hindrance?
Yeah, I mean, I think climate change is arguably the most urgent of the crises that we face, and it envelops many of the other crises. So if the climate fails, a lot of the other ones become moot, and we fundamentally can't totally optimize for all outcomes. But I do agree with Jim that there are loads of risks to only focusing on carbon. But there are also lots of synergies. There's aspects of solving the climate crisis that tie in with biodiversity, particularly when you're thinking about agricultural land use, which is a really interesting discussion that maybe we'll touch on a bit in due course around land sparing, land sharing. So I think focusing on carbon, but not ignoring the other aspects of nature probably is a help. I think within that, as I was discussing in my presentation, we need to be careful about how we account for carbon to make sure that we focus on the right things that have the maximum impact. We need to consider land use and also the relative importance of different greenhouse gases. Within the term carbon, there's lots of different greenhouse gases that have different radiative forcing, different lifetimes in the atmosphere. So we need to decide how we're going to focus on carbon. But I think probably on the whole, it is a help.
Carbon momentum can be useful. And Alice, have you got anything to add there?
I mean, I completely agree with everything that Becca and Jim have said there. I think that climate change, quite rightly, has the interest of the public, and therefore from Tesco's perspective, the consumer. Our net zero targets really underpin our entire environmental sustainability strategy. But as has been said, we're simultaneously experiencing a nature crisis. And I think it's our responsibility as a retailer and as the largest retailer to make sure that our agenda goes so much further than that, and that we cut across other key environmental outcomes, biodiversity, water, soil, but also other outcomes, social, farm incomes, rural communities, animal welfare. It all needs to be thought about as part of a bigger picture of sustainability of the agriculture sector as a whole, as well as the environment. And I think in that respect, some of the language and the focus around net zero can be a little bit limiting, and it puts us in these kind of binary debates, like land sparing versus land sharing, that may not necessarily achieve that much. But I do think there's no other sector. We all often talk about the fact that farming, contributes to the problem, but equally is the solution, and that not many other sectors are in a position like that. It's not just for climate. We've got a role and responsibility here as for farming and for food production, and for the whole food value chain, to make sure we're delivering across a wide range of environmental and social benefits, because we can, and because not many other sectors have that same opportunity.
It's brilliantly put, Alice. Thank you. And this is a question that somebody from WWF would ask, I guess, but is also asked by Adam. And to the panel, I ask: does nature, do ecosystems automatically benefit from low carbon, high sequestration agriculture? Is it a prerequisite that species will recover if we adopt the kind of interventions that Jim and Becca have analysed in their reports? Who should I go to first? Alice, do you want to kick off, or?
Yeah, sure. I think at a high level, yes, strategies that are going to reduce emissions and increase carbon sequestration often rely on nature-based solutions. So there's going to be plenty of flow-on benefits for nature and biodiversity. But these benefits aren't just going to happen automatically. We need to be actively considering them in farm decision-making, land use decision-making. I think low emissions farming, as Becca has really covered, is a vast term that encompasses all range of farming practices, and comes in all shapes and forms. And it could be talking about intensive efficient systems where nature doesn't necessarily feature, but emissions intensity is low. Equally, if we're planting, monoculture crops or trees that might be sequestering a significant amount of carbon, that might not be having a positive impact on nature and biodiversity, and Jim covered that in his presentation. So we need to be thinking about farms as ecosystems, finding ways for supply chains and for retailers to kind of be promoting benefits beyond climate and carbon. But equally, there are so many areas where it does work. I think looking at land use with a climate carbon lens, we know that carbon can be used as a proxy for soil health, which then can indicate the health of a farm ecosystem, which impacts water and biodiversity. So there are, I think, plenty of benefits to be thinking about low carbon, high sequestration farming and flow-on benefits to nature, definitely.
It's good to hear for nature's recovery. And Becca or Jim, do you have anything to add on there on the interventions that you guys analysed, looking at some of those co-benefits? Are they automatic or do they require consideration?
Yeah, I think they're not automatic. Not every intervention that reduces carbon impact also benefits nature, but I think there are some that do have a clear climate nature win-win. Perhaps the most clear-cut example would be improving fertilizer use efficiency, reducing emissions associated with fertilizer production, which I noted as a question and was actually included in the report, but I didn't spend time touching on in this presentation. And also reducing runoff from fertilizer benefiting nature. There are some interventions that are perhaps a bit more debatable. So something like no-till would be a good example. It reduces soil carbon emissions and can then improve soil health, but there is an issue around increased herbicide use, which may be detrimental to nature, but that might be offset by the benefit to soil health. So that's one that's open for debate. And then again, going back to land use, which is super live debate, but it's potentially the biggest win-win between carbon and nature is improving land use efficiency. Averted deforestation and natural regeneration can benefit both. But the counter argument to this that Alice touched on is that high intensity production can lead to farmland being relatively devoid of nature. So again, this is entering that whole land sharing, land sparing debate. And, in terms of the land sparing debate, you might have a relatively nature depleted farm area, but if the production is still sustainable, then maybe that actually has a global benefit to nature. So it's not beneficial at a farm level, but it is at a global level. I think these are all, there are no clear-cut answers, but I think they're useful things to be thinking about.
Brilliant. Yeah, and I guess with that land sparing approach, that you'd have to ensure that the intensity wouldn't degrade the asset ultimately, and then lead to more appetite for more land
and I think
spare.
Sustainability there is key.
Yeah. Jim, have you got anything to add finally on that question around the benefit to the co-benefits of the interventions?
Yeah, I think I agree with what's being said. The way I think about this really is that those regenerative practices are almost always going to be no regrets from an environmental perspective, but they won't necessarily deliver all the environmental outcomes you think they will in a particular place. So that's where it becomes significant if you look at, for example, the carbon offsetting market. It really matters for the carbon offsetting market whether in a particular place your intervention has actually sequestered carbon or not. If you're looking more broadly in a policy lens at what you want farmers to do kind of across the country, regenerative practices are fairly no regrets, with the small caveat of the kind of land use intensity thing and making sure that we're not ending up using way more land. And there's lots of debates to be had about that as well, which I don't expect we have time to get into here. But yeah, so for me, it's basically no regrets, but it doesn't necessarily deliver all the outcomes you might want it to in every instance.
And you mentioned there, Jim, and this is the final question I guess I got for the panel, and it links to a question from Sue, actually, that you mentioned regenerative, and regenerative agriculture is probably going to be the buzzword of over the next 3 days, and systems-based approaches. Regenerative agriculture, agroecology, organic farming, whatever they are, how do these kind of system-based approaches link to the relatively intervention-based analysis of the reports that we've commissioned? Maybe Alice, do you want to start on that one, on the role of regenerative agriculture and systems like that in this debate?
I do. I mean, I think regenerative agriculture and agroecology is where this all intersects: low emissions, high sequestration, all the other environmental outcomes, water, biodiversity, soil. It is a buzzword within the farming community and within the retailer and supplier sector. And I think it's just starting to filter down through to the consumer, but that is such an important part of the piece that we need to be thinking about. We need the consumers to actively be embracing this and increasing the demand, which comes back to the retailer. The retailer has a role in trying to make sure that the demand is matching the supply here, but also working, I think, to influence and ultimately, potentially, redesign supply chains so that we are able to see these products transparently working their way through the food value chain and onto supermarket shelves where consumers are buying them because they don't understand what they are and they want to buy them. And I think this is probably an area that you and I can work on, Callum, through the partnership and start building on that evidence base and thinking about how we can incentivize soil health improvements and regenerative agriculture within supply chains. But we need to think really, really carefully about what this looks like within a global food system. We can't be thinking about this in just a UK focus. We need to think about consumption patterns, how, what a wide scale shift towards regeneration or regenerative practices in agroecology would actually look like within a global food system. Because I think if we don't do that, we miss the bigger picture. But I think we can all agree that a move towards agroecology is such a massive part of the solution, arguably is the solution for food security, for climate, for nature.
Brilliant. Well, I mean, that is a really strong point to end on, and it's a really good point, Alice. We've got to match the demand with the supply, haven't we? So getting it's great 3 days. We can talk about regenerative agriculture a lot, but yeah, it's really going to be exciting to get the consumers engaged on that as well. So on that point, I'd just like to say thank you to Alice, to Becca and to Jim for their contributions to this. I hope everyone's enjoyed this first session of Oxford 2022. And I wish you all a safe and pleasant evening and the next 3 days. And I'll hand back over to Sarah and Barbara to close off day one.
Thanks so much, and thank you to the team and your expert panel, not only for some fascinating information, but for dealing with so many questions. And I was looking at the questions in the chat thinking, gosh, those are really, really interesting questions. And I think that the reports that we've heard today and the questions that you've had just reflect the complexity and the challenges that go around farming at the moment in 2022, but also that there are definite threads that are beginning to emerge around agroecology, around min and no-till, which people are beginning to understand and get behind in terms of truly sustainable agriculture. So as Callum said, that is our last session for today. Thank you to him. Thank you to all our fringe leaders. We have had more engagement than we could possibly have imagined. 200-300 people in some cases on our fringes, which is far more than we could have even rammed, even pre-COVID, we could have rammed into our rather stuffy rooms sometimes in Oxford. So thank you so much for your engagement and the passion which we've seen in the chat today and the engagement. It's been absolutely delightful to see and really inspiring and encouraging. So it just remains for me to say on behalf of myself and Barbara, thank you so much for joining us. See you bright and early at 8:15, I think it is, tomorrow morning, and we've got a packed day of some really world-class speakers then. But until then, bye-bye, have a cup of coffee, put your feet up, maybe even a glass of wine, and join us bright and early tomorrow for our full main day of the Oxford Farming Conference. Thanks.